My name is Katie Chironis. I'm a game designer. I currently do double duty. By day, I work at Oculus, where I experiment with cool virtual reality stuff. And by night, I am an indie developer, currently leading the team at Elsinore, and we're making a Shakespearean time-looping adventure game. So I've done a lot of diverse things during my time in the industry. I have worked on large, sort of like AAA scale projects, and I've worked on very small sort of indie productions. I've worked on mobile, I've shipped consoles, I've now shipped a VR headset. I have done all kinds of weird and crazy things. It has been a wild last few years. And the downside is that it's been sort of like exposed me to the tumultuousness of the games industry as a whole. But the upside is that I've gotten to see a lot of different studios and a lot of different cultures and the many, many ways that people make games across the industry as a whole.
Today's episode is going to be a little bit different from our normal episodes, of course, because whereas a lot of episodes are based around a developer's personal history and anecdotes and experiences, in this case, I what sort of inspired this episode, right, is I think I saw you tweeting being pretty upset about the state of game education, and there's several things that can mean. Because neither of us are necessarily experts in it, we still want to have a discourse about it, so we've put out a survey, gathered, it looks like about 32 responses. And so we're kind of using that to inform our discussion today, but we're also just going to be talking, I'm sure, about, in your case as well, there's a lot of developers I've known that I see at E3s and Siege and GDCs and Indiecades who've gone through different schools. And while we're not necessarily going to try to, highlight anyone's personal situation, kind of just talking about, what are some of the complications? What are some of the risks or advantages?
I went to college at Carnegie Mellon University, which has a graduate program in game development, but I actually did not attend that program. I instead did my undergraduate degree, and in my nights and weekends, I was a part of the Game Creation Society, which Chris founded.
Right. Open disclosure. That's how we know each other.
Yes,
so there's no
we've met through that alum group. And I started making games sort of on the side, on my weekends, my volunteer time. But I had a lot of close friends who were in the graduate program at Carnegie Mellon, and I sort of saw the challenges that they faced in getting the education. It's sort of the disconnect between what they thought they were getting and what they actually got when they went through the program. And now that I've had some exposure to working in the industry full time, I've noticed that there, again, is this disconnect between what people think they're signing up for when they apply to attend a game-focused degree or graduate program and what the reality is like, barring a few specific sort of high-quality cases. The longer I've gone on, the more I have sort of been contacted by students and by people who are recent graduates sort of saying, hey, like I just graduated with this degree from, this college, and I really want to be a game designer or want to be a game artist. And I haven't really heard back from any companies. I was told that my degree was going to get me a job, but it really hasn't gone anywhere. What can I do? And, my response to them is kind of like, well, let's see, like, what does your degree prepare you to do? Like, what kinds of classes did you take? What kind of skills do you have? And often the answer is many fewer skills and sort of projects than I would assume from somebody coming out of a specialized program. And so that sort of has left me feeling really upset about the state of these programs. And that's kind of why I went on that rant in the first place.
Right. And so this is something, too, that, I want to identify, too. So ETC is the name of that graduate school at Carnegie Mellon, where I also did not attend the grad school. I was also an undergrad in computer science when I was helping to establish the processes for that club. And even though that's a case that's both close to both of us, since that's, students and friends we had in there, and I think our club, even at some point early on, we had a few members from ETC who kind of dropped by. I think Bei Yang led a project. He went on to, I think he's now at Disney. Lots of people have been able to find careers for that stuff. And I want to point out, too, that like ETC is considered by all rights. It's a great program with good professors. It's kind of cream of the crop among these, and there's still challenges. And so likewise, where I did my master's, where I've spent some PhD years but did not get a PhD. Georgia Tech, likewise, their digital media program, good professors. It's considered a really reputable program, helps connect some people to jobs, but still challenges. And then out here in Los Angeles, where some of my first exposure to this isn't quite right was when I was starting my internships in industry about a decade ago, and I'd be at lunch with, as at Electronic Arts Los Angeles, And I like to sit with the QA people because I found they had a lot more passion. They weren't maybe as jaded as some of the people who'd been making games for a long time in corporate environment. But what I was surprised was that how many of those QA people like had master's degrees from, say, USC, which again is a good program with good professors, cream of the crop school in game design by all respective measures. And yet I was like, but they could have got a QA job like with high school behind them. Like that should not be the point of having finished an upper level education merit. And so trying to figure out like what's going on here. And I think there's a lot of systematic challenges about it, but I mean, I'm curious to hear too, both from either your reading over kind of our survey responses or your impressions from friends you've talked to of where's this disconnect?
Yeah. So I think it's there's kind of two issues right now that I could see. The first being expectation. I think there is kind of this historic tradition of a college degree being something that it's like a skills degree. It's going to train you in the skills necessary to step out the door with your diploma and immediately walk into a job where you're trained to perform that job. If you look at it in the way of like law school or medical school, like of course, like when you graduate from medical school, you are qualified to sort of start working. With games degrees, there's no such guarantee.
It's tough because I've seen like people who have gone through a program where they probably went into debt for, coming out of it with kind of the same career options they had when they went in.
Yep.
But I also want to mention too and stress that like every teacher I've ever met in every program of state schools, of vocational schools, of arts institute, etc., super care about their students, want the best for everybody, are trying to fix the system from the inside if they feel like something's not right about it. It's always much more right at like the administrative level, at this like layers of bureaucratic machine.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think it's really not the faculty's fault. Honestly, in this case, like many of the problems stem from how little faculty are often paid in these programs and how poorly they're compensated. Right. It really is like a large sort of administrative overhead issue at its core.
Well, and so then the other thing too, when we talk about the challenges of, are they teaching what's relevant? I mean, this is something that, to what extent is academia serving that need of like vocational job training stuff, where when we talk to professors themselves, a lot of them will defend. And I think with all the right spirit of like, the universities weren't really supposed to be jobs programs. And it's tricky because the industry treats them like one and they charge like they are.
I mean, so I would argue against that for two reasons.
Sure.
Number one, you look at the number of jobs out there for games, and there actually are quite a number of available and open job positions that people are often recruiting really hard for. The problem is that these jobs start at 3 years of experience, and they go up from there. And I think there is something crucial that is not connecting graduates to that required. Because in theory, you spend 4 years at a game design degree, 3 years of experience required. Of course, if those 3 years really truly made up for the skills gap, then any graduate would count for any of those sort of medium tier game dev positions, but they don't.
Right. Well, I did know a couple of recruiters at bigger companies who would say that like they would count graduate school towards those 2 years required experience. And this is, asterisks, certain graduate schools they would count towards that experience.
Exactly. Right. But certain schools count.
Yes. And then the other interesting thing about that though was that something I didn't realize was that a lot of that introductory funnel that they have, their university admissions programs at some large companies, are kind of like specifically, if you're within a few years of having graduated from a school, you kind of take a different channel in. There's a different interview process. There's different people you're dealing with than if you have been out even like 2 or 3 years, maybe doing a perfectly legit job somewhere else with Microsoft or IBM or you name it, Frog Design, etc. And then trying to find your way into those companies, and you have a completely different in than if you have that recent university credential, which kind of goes back to this kind of idea that in some ways, and it's hard because obviously there's value being gained there, but like a lot of what we're gaining is access to that network or sort of that in of we have that brand connected to us. And these are always hard conversations to have with people, in part because obviously like both, I suspect you, certainly me, it helped connect me to my first job opportunities that I had that like Carnegie Mellon pedigree attached.
Yeah, absolutely.
Even though like we weren't in a games program, and a surprisingly small percentage of computer science really ever relates to the kind of game programming I've ever done. Yeah. Not to say it faults computer science, just like it's just not what most gameplay programming involves, right?
Yeah, and hilariously, I often think that actually the prestige of game programs is frequently tied to the computer science programs they're paired with, like CMU, USC, RIT, DigiPen.
Right, Stanford.
A lot of these, the programs have weight not inherently because of the quality of their games program, because of the CS program or the programming degree that's tied to them.
USC is probably one of those exceptions to that, in which I know that, so whereas at Carnegie Mellon, the ETC is sort of a merging of the drama school and the computer science programs. At USC, it's specifically it's spun off the film program there.
Right.
And so I think that also results in much kind of higher budget production approaches and mentalities to it. I recently went to a USC demo, and again, I don't want to sound any of this like we're hating on it or like it's a bad thing. It helps some people a lot. It's definitely a good thing for some people's path. But they had this demo, and they'd set it up like a little E3, which was awesome, where like the students had made posters to promote their stuff. They'd all clearly gone through iterations of layers of design. They'd all clearly like gained from it. But one of the games actually included like, it was kind of I think it was one of the graduate projects, showing like collecting money to pay off their debt. And the debt number was like 89,000. And I was like, is this like exaggerated for hyperbole? And they was like, no, that's my amount of debt from this school. It's not cheap. Now that included some undergrad debt, but I was like, wow, my body temperature changed. I was like, wow, that's especially because again, like if it was, if someone goes out and spends $90,000 on a car or something and they get that car, that's one thing because they know what they got for it. But if they're like spending it on a chance, it may or may not get them the skill or the practice or the experience that they expect from it. That's a whole nother terrifying thing.
Right. The car may or may not have four wheels attached when you get it.
Exactly.
And it may or may not have four-wheel drive.
Yeah, we rolled the die. You got a tricycle.
Right.
Yeah. No. It's also in all fairness, and it's impossible to say, but it's hard to also separate out like to what extent is it each student's responsibility to make the most of the opportunities afforded to them. Because every program out there at best, you're playing an odds game, but to expect that every single person who goes through and comes out is going to have the same opportunity is kind of not realistic. One of the questions that you had suggested for our survey that I thought was a great one was like, how many products, games had been shipped by professors you had in the past 7 years? And
it seems like it's very low.
Very
honestly.
low.
The response is very few.
And one of the things that I figured out from my time in graduate school was that like that's kind of inherent in the system. That 7-year time period. It was funny to me you picked that number of years because like okay, so let's say I'd spend a little time in industry. Then I went for my master's. It was 2 years, and I went for a PhD. That they claim it could be done in 3. Realistically, most of my classmates spent 6 or more doing that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. Then they're supposed to do a postdoc somewhere. Supposed to be kind of a fellowship somewhere. They have sort of assistant professorship somewhere. By the time they're actually in that professorship position, it's already been probably 10 years since they shipped, professional industry experience shipping something. And that like there's not a clear fix for that. Every 3 to 5 years, the game industry takes massive turns, right? I mean, casual games kind of came out of nowhere. MMOs came out of nowhere. Free-to-play came out of nowhere. Mobile games came out of nowhere. And as soon as these things come up, like they're gone before someone who masters a study of them would be in a teaching position. There
are still some basic things you can look at when you are determining whether or not you should attend a game development program, I think.
Those sound really helpful. What are some of the things you have in mind?
I think some of the obvious ones are, number one, talk to the professors or look them up. Have any of them shipped a game in the past decade? And even, like you'll see it at USC or any of the higher tier programs, a lot of the professors, even though they haven't actively been in the industry, they've kept up with their side work. They've been mentoring at other projects actively outside of their coursework. They've been really engaged in game conferences and advisory boards. And I think that's all sort of ways of staying in touch with the industry. If your professors aren't doing even that, then they're not qualified to be teaching you. I will say, I think the second point is how many games you're going to make in your program. Like you should, when you're looking at the curriculum, review and look for courses that explicitly state like Game Project 1 or Senior Game Honors Thesis or whatever. Capstone project. Yeah, exactly. And if you aren't making at least one game a year in your program, again, it's not worth its salt. Like just straight up. You should be making like really the thing that is going to get you a job in games is having made games. Right. There is like no amount of great sort of game design document work, no amount of like beautiful portfolio work. It all amounts to nothing. Like your theory crafting, no one cares unless you've made games. That is truly all that matters.
Right. Well, and that's the case where, of course, you and I, through the Game Creation Society at Carnegie Mellon, might I add, made games extracurricularly. And of course, when I went to Georgia Tech, started the same kind of club there with VGDev. And when I left graduate school, started the same kind of club here in Los Angeles, Gamkedo Club, where like people. So I guess part of the value too is like no matter which school they're at, no matter what they're studying, even if their school doesn't have a games program, conceivably they can still be making the games. They can still be putting in that time. And we talk about like, okay, well, game industry is a rough place, even if someone has the credentials, even if they have made games. There's lots of people who've made games who still have trouble finding work in it. I wonder, is it a reasonable kind of strategy for people if they take their primary major or whatever and consider maybe the more safe bet or like the fallback job, and outside of their extracurricularly make games? Obviously, I'm sure there's some trade-offs there too, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so that's kind of what you and I did. And I think it definitely has its pros in that, for example, I pursued 2 degrees that could have helped me pay rent and keep the lights on if I didn't get into the games industry, which is hugely useful. And in fact, the odds are against you when you're trying to break into games, right? The odds are that most people in these programs will not find work in the games industry. So it's kind of just like hedging your bets to get degrees that aren't in games primarily. The downside, I think personally, is that a games program will connect you with eager, intelligent people who are interested in making games. And, what you do with those people is up to you. But, sometimes I think outside of one of those degrees, it can be difficult, especially if you're at a university that doesn't have any kind of games program or tradition, to connect with people that are interested in making games with you in the first place. Right.
Yeah. I know certainly finding a team is a challenge for a lot of folks. Been part of what I tried to spin up this club. Because basically, I mean, in realizing in my case that I'm not trying to make a commercial for it, but just that a lot of the value that we got was from this club or that club. And then realizing that I thought of those clubs as free at the time because we didn't have dues when I was in charge of them, at least. And I think even now we probably have dues for 1 or 2 of them, but they're probably pretty modest. But there was still this pretty substantial tuition hurdle people were paying to even be able to take part in that. And I realized I can get people in the same room making games together or over the internet a heck of a lot cheaper since I'm not paying to manicure 400-acre lawns and have a football stadium and a chemistry lab with insurance for explosions.
It's a good idea.
Yeah, and that making games together is totally possible in a way that, and I'm not the only company doing it. I mean, there's a lot of matchmaking, team up, indie coordinating services, chat forums, options out there right now. I want to say a bit about in Elsinore. Do I remember correctly? So did y'all find the team of each other through the club, and then the Kickstarter was a separate game, or is that a game you'd already started somewhat before graduation, etc.?
Actually, so my entire indie sort of side project team on Elsinore met through Game Creation Society. We were all friends before that. And I actually, for a contest in the Game Creation Society, I think the theme was Shakespeare for that week. And I was like, oh, wouldn't it be cool if there was an adventure game where you played as Ophelia from Hamlet instead of Hamlet? And I started working on a prototype with Connor, who was the president of the club at the time, Connor Fallon. We were just kind of messing around. And then we pulled in a few more of our friends. Then we graduated and we stopped work on it. We all went off to get real jobs. But about 6 months after we graduated and we were all working, we were like, we really miss working together on the weekends and just kind of like that jam-like feeling that making games had when we were students.
Right.
So we started doing it purely as just a way to hang out on the weekends. And it kind of snowballed until it was this giant thing. And we were like, well, I guess we're going to run a Kickstarter now and form an LLC.
So then y'all were showing it at the Indie Mega booth at GDC, right?
Yeah.
That's pretty great.
Yeah, I guess that's the kind of thing that can happen when you find people that are willing and motivated to make tiny games with you.
Right.
They spin out of control.
Well, yeah, I was going to say, you say tiny, but it's how long has it been working on it and how many people are involved?
Man, okay, so it's been since 2013, so it's been 3 years now.
Tiny game.
We started off as a team of 4, and now it was myself, Connor, Eric, and Kristen, and then Val joined shortly afterwards. Now I think we're at 10 total, including contractors.
Right.
So yeah, it has completely exploded in a good way.
Right.
Very exciting though.
Remember, there's another category of our questions about what preparation or prior experience did they have before getting formal education related to games. And in thinking about, cases of people who've come out of games programs and found success either through their career or through kickstarting, or in some cases kind of some measure of indie. And, we're not talking multi-million-dollar top of the Steam charts indie, but indie and paying their bills somehow through it, maybe a little bit of scramble and ramen. I think a lot of those people, they had some momentum going into it, right? I mean, it wasn't just like they got there and they had no start. They had made some things prior. And I'm curious, are there anybody on the Elsinore team who, maybe it goes further back than before you knew them, who had made games before college, or has it all started inside that club, Game Creation Society, where they first started making games?
I'm not sure if every single one of us had made games before college, but I think a fair number of us had at least played around with the appropriate tools. Like, we were all familiar with basics like Photoshop and some basic programming languages. Like, I took AP Computer Science in high school, and I had made a simple game in that class once before.
Gotcha.
I think most others had as well. So we were at least versed in the basics, sort of the core elements that you need to make games, which are drawing and sketching, doing a little bit of programming, a little bit of storytelling, a little bit of mythology. Like these are all sort of I would call the corner pieces to kickstarting your game education before you even get on campus.
Right. Well, and that's something that I know, especially at the graduate level. One of the things that I used to be skeptical or concerned about was like, we talk about master's degrees and like they're kind of inherently typically 2 years, right? I mean, there might be some way to accelerate it in 1. Some people probably take 3, but they're kind of usually built for 2. And that's such a short window of time in which there's kind of this immediate pressure for their thesis work, whether it's an MFA terminal degree, whether it's a master's in science, whatever, to go from never made a game to like make something new and innovative.
Yeah, I completely agree. I have known many people who went through, so for example, like USC's grad program, which is very good. But honestly, like of the many, many people I know who've gone through the program, very few of them did not have some game making experience before they went in, honestly, of those who are working in the industry now. I think it's interesting because I think a lot of academics right now are struggling to find the balance between a vocational school and a true academic sort of experimental exploratory environment, right? Because one is very industry focused and the other is more focused on the arts, which is what game development ultimately is. But like, for example, I have heard from students coming out of DigiPen who will say, hey, I did 2 years at DigiPen. It was very vocational. I wasn't really getting a full sort of liberal arts education in the classic university sense. And they failed me out, like for whatever reason, like they couldn't keep up with the coursework or whatever. And they're like, so I tried to transfer and oops, my credits don't transfer because DigiPen isn't a university, it's a business.
Yep.
And so then you sort of like see these universities, I think Vancouver Film School is another one where they're very good at targeting you vocationally, but you have to be careful because if you decide halfway through that you don't want to do it anymore, you're starting over from scratch.
Right.
Like you can't then change to a university afterwards. It's not how it works.
Right.
What I think often, honestly, even people in the games industry are poor at this is the process of learning how to make a game, right? Like you look at a program like my major at CMU was human computer interaction, which is like UX, user experience design.
Right.
And they don't teach you any particular tool in UX. They teach you how to design a product, right? Like the sort of the sensibilities and the thought processes that go behind that. Whereas with game programs, it often there's very little forethought about well, what are the core elements of like how to build a game that you should know? And what are the fundamentals there? And like, there's very little often covering of those fundamentals. And one of the best ways to hammer in those fundamentals is to keep making games, right? Because that's how you learn that process until you really feel it.
To find the pattern among having done a variety of different things.
Right.
Gotcha. Well, and so this is also, when you mentioned like HCI, that reminds me of one of the mentalities that I've seen come out of design schools and design-oriented programs and design-related fields is one of client spec work, addressing like, I am not my main customer. I am not my main client. There is some need to be met here that I'm trying to help Microsoft accomplish or, whatever company or team accomplish. And I do wonder if, I know certainly in some of the programs, they're much more kind of oratory focused, where it's like, you're making your own game, you're doing your own creative thing. And I wonder if some of this also just this tension between if they're steering them towards a career at a studio as opposed to trying the independent die roll of doing kind of their own thing. As to, I think part of what hits a lot of students pretty hard right out of school is that they've spent years making their own games on their own teams with their own visions. And they're realizing that when they get hired, they're getting hired to build a small part of someone else's existing franchise or target for a client, etc.
Yes, I think honestly, so I think SMU Guildhall maybe has a bit of this, and Iowa State I think also does this. CMU definitely did this, where you have sometimes you have a subset of client projects.
Right.
So like you'll be called in to make like a game that teaches accounting to children living in inner city Fresno or something like that, and you are then building a product for a client, which is really what all of game development is, unless you're like you said, rolling the dice on going indie. And I think those programs, like if you see a program offering something like that, that is so huge. Like that's one of the rare cases where I think you can put that on a resume and any studio will see that as actual work experience because you weren't making a game for yourself.
Right. And that's something I definitely remember going on the computational media undergrad level stuff with Georgia Tech, where they would have like outside clients for some of their projects where they're assigned, try to help meet their spec or try to help serve their need. And there'd be this very weird effect where, if we were trying to impress our friends, right, we want to show them, here's this thing I made, here's my vision. Whereas really when you're applying for a lot of, especially, intro level positions, they want to see that you know how to serve someone's goals that aren't yours.
Right.
To build along someone else's vision.
Yeah. It really is about like, how can you, like I think a lot of students are sort of like, oh, like I hate working in teams. Like I hate group work. It's so dumb. It's so pointless. That is 100% of what making games is, right? Like it's all just one big middle school group project forever.
Yes. That's a good way to frame it. And like you say, a lot of the value of these programs when they're done right is bringing together people of different backgrounds, different skill sets. And I think one of the things that makes this just a very tangled puzzle for universities to solve, right, is that kind of inherent in that cross-disciplinary need to bring together artists and writers and programmers is that schools, universities by their nature are very siloed, right? I mean, there's very much like, well, this credit counts for our computer science department. This requirement doesn't span both or whatever, as far as who the faculty are, as far as how the money can be spent, as far as which classes people can register for. It has been one of the slowdowns early on for trying to get games in universities where they were kind of built for putting a bunch of software engineers in the same room or a bunch of artists in the same room, which, I'm partial to the business phrase, like 10 clowns don't make a circus.
Right. Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, this is why I tend to sort of advocate for universities that will have usually you see better sort of course offerings and interdepartmentality if you have a program that's tied closely to a CS or an art school or a film school.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you sort of have a university where the game program is completely on its own and there really isn't a strong existing arts or new media or film or CS program, It tends to suffer from that more so than others, I think. Georgia Tech, great example. They have this incredible CS program. So obviously those two tied together really nicely. USC's Viterbi School of Engineering is one of the best in the world. So they work together really closely. And their film school, of course, is #1 in the world easily. So that works great.
Well, no, so speaking of these connections, though, it's not, of course, just the peers, but you also asked the question for our survey of did the program connect them to industry speakers and or active studios? Because I will also say that part of what my first opportunities came from was this club I helped establish there. We brought in a guest speaker from EA Tiburon, I think it was, and we're only able to do that because they were already on campus to talk to the Carnegie Mellon ETC graduate students. And so that's how we were able to kind of poach them to come talk to our club also. Certainly that can be a huge difference, right? That direct access. And we're not talking about percentages just because we have a sample set of 31. But some of these schools, yes, absolutely have indies and Disney and Ubisoft people coming in. Some of these schools, none, as far as guest speakers from industry and active studios and connection. Yeah. Probably another thing for them to look for or ask around about.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I have been approached often by students that, go to University of Mizzou or something in the middle of nowhere. And they're like, hey, I don't have any game dev studios close by. I don't really know of any game developers. There are no local meetups, but I'd really like to talk to somebody and just understand what they do for a living.
Right.
And I'm always happy to open up an email dialogue with them about, well, what is it you want to do? Where do you see yourself headed? And I think that many game developers also are willing to do that, and they just don't often get approached. Right. So that's it. That could be a huge strategy for students that go somewhere where they don't have easy access to those kinds of institutions already.
Oh yeah, well, and I'll also say that. So I brought this up the other day when I had a little panel at Indicate East, but I've now spoken at a lot of schools over Skype. And for our club, we've had remote guest speakers from the East Coast, from all over the country. Especially for as generous and as eager as many game developers are to want to help the next generation of people, even if your school is by some definition, middle of nowhere, email people, ask on Twitter, and you will find some people who will be happy to become those industry guest speakers, even if your program's not bringing them in for you.
Absolutely. And even just on a personal note, go on LinkedIn, find the person who's doing the job that you want to do someday and message them and be like, hi, I would love to sort of do what you're doing in a few years. What advice do you have for somebody like me who's just trying to break in? And what do you think is important for me to know and to learn while I'm here?
Right.
And they'll almost always get back to you.
This actually reminds me too of one of my little contentions I had with the bureaucracy when I was, fighting the good fight, still in the university, where at Georgia Tech, my club would bring in guest speakers from the area. Atlanta has a little bit of game industry around it. And this came up in one of the meetings with some of the higher ups in the school. They're like, oh, no, you shouldn't be doing that yourself. We should arrange that because they should be paying us to access the students here. And I'm like, I'm bringing them in. I'm not having them go through your paywall of thousands of dollars or whatever to come talk to the group that I arranged and brought together.
Right.
Seemed like they're actually putting up additional barriers to getting industry voices into our room, which was, to me, seemed pretty screwed up.
Yeah, there can be a lot of like sort of wheeling and dealing that goes on, right? That sort of prevents it from being an easy process. I honestly think that's why student clubs and organizations have a much easier time of it in general,
Right.
because they can just be like, oh, like let's have, Nina Freeman Skype in, which
Right.
is what my club did.
Yeah.
And like she'll just talk to the club. It'll be great. So
Totally.
easy.
Yeah, and again, kind of maybe even off the radar. Or this is also, it's hard how our clubs also squashed some of the cross-curriculum challenges that is inherent, like I say, in siloed university programs, where it was pretty trivial for us to just like, everybody who wants to come to this room comes to this room. Some of them were violin majors. Some of them were mechanical engineers. Nobody cared. We just made video games together.
Yeah.
In a way that like they couldn't register. You couldn't get everyone in the room to register for the same class. Like this, not how this, programs are built.
Right.
Obviously, so we asked about loan debt, and some of the numbers are modest, and hopefully the kind that, and a good job would pay off. And this is also something I don't want to make it sound like it's never a good decision for someone to take out a loan for education. Certainly, there are all kinds of opportunities only afforded through investing in themselves, and so if they can connect them to a better career, it can pay off that amount of money that have opportunities they wouldn't have had otherwise. I'm not trying to make it sound like that, but when I do see some numbers in this survey, like almost $238,000, that kind of gives me pause of like, when or how would that be the trade-off someone would consciously make, right? Or 100K, et cetera. So it starts to getting 6 digits. Certainly, I begin to
question it. I begin to ask, are there cheaper alternatives? Is there something else you could get a degree in for the same price that is going to guarantee you can pay the rent and keep the lights on? Do that instead and then make games on the side. It's so much less scary to be like the games industry. Just to be blunt, it has an average quota burnout rate of 5 years. So, like, if you think you could beat the average, awesome, and long live you and have a great time. But like, the fact of the matter is that most people do not stay in games for their entire career. And when you're done, it's good to have that degree to fall back on just in case.
Right. Yeah. A credential to help connect you to other opportunities, other things. Well, this also goes to those degrees, which, some of them are very game design specific. Some of them are more what we might call conventional curriculum, computer science, even just like kind of product design, UI, UX, HCI, et cetera. Where do we have the question on there about, game design specific degrees or not? And because I've heard from, certainly a decade ago, people were very skeptical of them, but I've still heard cases from employers and coworkers, former coworkers, who say that they actually prefer the coworkers or the employees who come from non-game specific programs for various reasons.
I have too, and it's kind of funny. I don't know I think it's honestly that many of these degrees are structured such that you aren't really learning those crucial skills, but it kind of gives you sort of it can give many students a false sense of not security. Like they believe they're coming in with a certain skill set that they really don't have because they haven't yet made anything.
Right. They're getting confidence out of it.
Right.
Which, to be fair, is also a thing I've heard about, like a lot of MBA programs, which to say there is also a monetary value on confidence in terms of putting yourself out
totally.
there. For
but at least an MBA, you're getting a master's in business, right? Like it's one particular thing. I think the issue with many design degrees is that you become a jack of all trades, master of none, right? You're not really deep in any particular area.
Right. Well, and that's what I want to say. So that question is actually from at BTingo on Twitter, BTENGU, who had asked, would you rather work with a new graduate who came out of a game design program or a more generic program? And generic here, not in a bad way, such as design or computer science. And of course, this is, not saying game design, but like design as a school, and why. And, a lot of the questions or a lot of people's responses, I just skimming through, we have generic one, we have open to either as long as they're passionate. But it seems like a few of them say game design, but overwhelmingly, I think a lot of the answers we got back were saying like they actually prefer kind of the more traditional education stuff.
Yeah, it's interesting that CS was one of the computer science was one of the options, because I guess I have a question for you, which is we see here in the survey, a lot of people are learning C#, C++, C, Java at their programs. But a lot of other people in traditional game design programs appear to not be learning any languages on the clock at school. Do you think it's required that somebody have a technical and coding background to be a successful game designer?
So certainly, there are game designers who do not, and especially if they do something like they specialize in, say, AAA style level design, where they've been able to work in tools or for sophisticated engines like modding of, making Fallout missions, making Unreal levels and whatever. That's a certain type of work that someone can do where they might be doing some sort of blueprint stuff. They might be doing some Kismet if they were still in UE3 kind of tech. They might be doing a little bit of scripting for triggers if they're in Unity or something, but they're not really expected to know how to build the engine from the kind of ground up kind of stuff. And it's certainly, it's not the case that everyone needs to be a software engineer. Now, that said, I do think that it can be a really instrumental and valuable skill set for anyone who even does want to focus on game design, in part because it enables them to prototype their own ideas, to demonstrate their own idea in a playable way. Even if it's not shippable, good, decent code, if they can show it working on their machine to put someone else in front of it, that's the next level of being able to communicate your design ideas in a real-time, high-performant kind of way. Then, the other situation we run into is if you're within the structure of a huge company and you can write on the whiteboard and the engineering team will get paid to implement your designs, that's one thing. Outside of those environments, it can be really hard to, you're kind of going around, you waving your piece of paper in the air of like, hey, will someone implement my thing for me? And you're tugging on shirts. And it's just not a strong position to be coming from versus I can show you my prototype, my proof of concept. Look, there's something here. Let's do something with it. It's easier to rally a team around.
Yeah, I think actually I completely agree with that. I think there's this common perception, especially on smaller teams, like sub 50 people, that designers are the least qualified people on the team, right. Just like as a general rule. And a lot of people will say some people will say, oh, game design is a valid skill, but a lot of people will say, oh, it's BS, right? Like, they don't do anything.
Yeah.
So if you can execute and be like, hey, I made this thing, one of my co-designers at work last week had this idea. And initially, people were kind of like, whatever. But then he prototypes it. And it was so obviously amazing.
Right. Just
the second you put on, the headset and tried it, it was like, oh, of course, we have to do this. This is great.
Right. Yeah, it's definitely something that can help separate potential candidates. But again, just to be also clear about, there are studios, and this is also a difference between companies. And there's studios where every designer there is expected to be a technical designer, able to script their own encounters, able to add to the AI, coding, whatever. And there's also studios where they have very, very pure design in terms of people who have never coded, will never code, but they're doing mock-ups, they're articulating designs to the rest of the team. They're kind of in what some studios are more of a producer role, where they're kind of facilitating, overseeing, and connecting other, talented, skilled craft people of art and of engineering stuff to get the results to shine. But that's something that is those positions, of course, are coveted, relatively rare. And even there, if they have a technical background, can be potentially a strength in communicating with others on the team, et cetera.
Yeah, they also tend to kind of be a little bit more old school companies. Right. I think you could probably get away with that working for Bethesda, mm-hmm. where, they're a little bit more old school and have this kind of long-standing tradition. But if you were to be a designer at pretty much any modern company or formed in the last 10 years, I think you would be expected to script at the very least, if not write code.
I want to go back to this, subject of do you have some advice for them, not only what to look out for, but obviously it's tricky because everyone's situation is unique. But now in 2016, let's say you meet somebody and they're like, hey, I've not gone to a school yet. I'm considering it. How do you just lay it out? What's your kind of summary or takeaway from all the moving parts, which I know is tough, but.
Yeah, I guess I would have a number of pieces of advice for them. I think the first one would be, have you ever tried to make a game on your own? If not, pick up a free tool like Unity or Stencil or whatever and try making something on your own. If you can't even bust that out, a simple, we're talking a Pong clone or a checkers clone, something really simple. If you can't do that, you may want to think about why that is so difficult and then envision the rest of your life just being that, because that's what making games is. If you find that you can and you enjoy it, then I would look at, a U.S. News and Weekly report, I think, and Forbes will do a stack ranking of the top game design and development schools in the country, right. At least in the U.S. Those are you can pretty much guarantee that the top 10 programs on that list are quality. And if you apply to them, you're at least going to get a significant amount out of it, even if it's not guaranteed to get you a job.
Right. And even if it's expensive, that at least it feels like it's as good as your odds you can get out of it.
Right. The odds are in your favor.
Right.
I would say if you feel like you can't afford one of those programs or for some reason they're not accessible to you, or you have gotten into another program and you're trying to consider whether or not to go to it, look at what the faculty have done. Have they shipped anything recently? Have they made games? When were they last active? If they haven't been active recently, it's probably not a safe bet. How many games are you going to make? If the number is lower than 4, heavily scrutinize the program. You should be making at least 1 game a year. And I'm not talking about prototypes, by the way.
Right.
I'm talking about fully polished complete game titles that have a start menu and a credit screen.
You don't mean that there's a game jam each year. You mean that they've spent a semester or whatever building a thing.
Yeah, because we had some responses from people who were like, well, I've only really made one complete game, but I've made 50 plus prototypes. And I'm like, well, nobody is going to want to see your 50 plus prototypes. That's simply not how games are made. Like, polish is really what people want to see when they're hiring.
Right. The real yield from those prototypes is how many of them then did you then take and build something polished out of?
Right, exactly. I think the last option I would propose is an ability to specialize. Like if it's sort of a very generalist degree through and through, it's going to be much more difficult to find employment because the number of entry-level design positions that exist is like about null.
Right.
So if you can specialize, whether that's in art, production, engineering, whatever, I think that is the sign of what makes a program really great.
These are all such rapidly changing things, right? I mean, it's part of what makes the entire university conversation such a difficult one, where certainly, like, for my dad's generation, he was able to pay his way through a good school, selling books door to door, able to connect himself to a much better paying job because he had a degree, and at that time, a lot of people didn't. And obviously, like, every year, those costs are going up significantly. The amount of differentiation it gives you in the market for any job, not just games, is continuously, a little bit diluted by so many people who are also have taken that path. And it's still obviously a good investment for a lot of people, but it makes this conversation more and more difficult or more nuanced, I think, every year in a way that it's tough because it's such a moving target as to like, will this still apply in 2020? Who knows?
Yeah, it's really hard to say.
And so the one thing I also want to end on is if you want to mention websites they can find out more about Elsinore or Twitter handles where they can find about more of your opinions and things so they can look up and continue the conversation or find out more about your work.
Yeah, absolutely. My personal Twitter handle is @KatieChironis. So that's Katie, CHIRONIS. You can find more about Elsinore at elsinore-game.com. And Elsinore is ELSINORE.
Sweet. Okay, well, thanks so much for taking the time to chat. I think it's been helpful, and obviously it's not like we can, in conclusion, do or don't, but hopefully just start some more of that critical discussion out there for people to disagree with and then look into on their own and whatnot.
Exactly. Thanks, that was fun.
Sweet. Music at the start and end of this podcast is provided by Danny Baranowski. Use with permission.